What's good for the most successful corporations is always ultimately good for all of us. Strongly disagree with that.
Ooh, you're so close to the point, King. Keep going, just a bit more.
Corporations and corporate America is probably the leading leftist institution in the country.
Wait. Businesses aren't, that's not how the, that's not how any of this works. Hey y'all, welcome back. As I've become more politically engaged over the years, some things occurred to me. Politics are confusing. Either someone's dropping a 1,237-point tax plan on your desk, or they're calling themselves a 1750 definition of liberal. At first you think that means they're like obsessed with old-timey values, but then you do your research and realize they're gay, but also hate even one step away from absolute laissez-faire capitalism. So you say to yourself, oh, so that's what 1750 libs were like, huh? Point being, it's a confusing topic to dip your toe into. After dipping my proverbial big toe into the pool of politics for a bit, it strikes me that Americans in particular don't know how to talk about politics very well, that the very framework through which we approach politics is faulty. Often when politicians and pundits talk about politics, the realm of possibilities is limited, confusing buzzwords are tossed around, and I get the sense these obfuscations are intentional rhetorical campaigns, meant to complicate and limit the scope of meaningful discussion for average folks. And I hate to sound like some sort of high-tootin'-falutin' aristocrat who views the art of discussion as the pinnacle of society. But in order to talk our way into any sort of good progress in this country, we have to have some baseline understandings of how the topics at hand work. As someone who'd like to see our political literacy increase, today I'm starting a new series. I'm going to start diving into the various ways that Americans don't seem to know how to talk about politics, and in turn search for solutions to improve our political literacy. For today's installment, I want to talk about the problems with how Americans discuss the political spectrum. I'll look at how our two-party system impacts our understanding of it, and I'll explore the shortcomings of our approach to politics. If you enjoy the topic and want to hear me talk about it more, consider subscribing down below and drop a comment to let me know which parts of this topic I should discuss next. If you really feel bossy and want to tell me what to do, consider becoming a patron of mine on Patreon, where you can request topics and vote on upcoming videos, as well as a bunch of other benefits. Links down in the description. Without further ado, let's go. Whoa there, partner. Before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's explain what we mean by political spectrum. Shouldn't we turn this into a new section of the video, though? Nah, this is our fourth time re-recording lines, so let's just make this definition quick. But won't it be confusing to put this at the end of the opener? There's no time! Really quickly, just wanted to spell out what I mean when I say political spectrum. In the context of this video, I mainly mean the range of ideas present in politics, their relation to each other, and what ideological camps we place each idea into. The problem with political discourse in America is that we often don't talk about politics as a political spectrum, but as a political binary. You're either Team Blue or Team Red. But this us versus them approach doesn't match the reality of politics, as values can and often are shared by groups you'd assume are political opponents. Like, is being a pacifist left or right wing? Is wanting free and open elections and not an oligarchy left or right wing? Is hating dictators left or right wing? The answer is neither side has total claim to any of those concepts, but our binary mindset has us trying to assign various values to a single side and claim them as ours, which is so useless. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a smaller square hole. In later sections, we'll explore more reasons why this approach is harmful, but first, let's get into why this right versus left rhetoric is here in the first place. Part 1. How we got here. I despise how we talk about the right versus the left, mainly because it directly leads to a lot of us versus them talk and only really serves to confuse and divide the electorate. It strikes me as a somewhat natural conclusion that a country with only two viable parties would use a lot of us versus them rhetoric, simultaneously tapping into and informed by humanity's worst in-group, out-group tendencies. But rather than assume it's just a natural outcome, it's important to consider why folks in power may want to keep it this way. If we assume for a moment that steps are taken to keep discourse as is, it seems clear to me that it's because the us versus them rhetoric is easy to campaign on. Coalition building's hard, especially in a big country like the US. How do you get an agnostic small business owner from Staten Island to vote alongside a Christian farmer from rural Idaho? Their interests are often so different, it's hard to make a platform that would appeal to them all perfectly. But you know what can bring them together? Person X bad. By Person X, I mean any generic person you're casting as an enemy. Establishing an enemy is a quick and easy way to bring people together. They might not agree with each other on everything, but they know they don't like Person X, that rat bastard. So rather than labor over making the perfect platform, politicians can just make their campaign about opposition to Person X, which is so much easier. It also allows politicians to avoid changing their platform. When your voters ask for something you don't want to support, just slap them with a quick, "Other man come from other side of politic, will enact bad thing if elected, vote me instead." You see this in Appalachia, where pro-union policies could galvanize folks, given the area's history of strong unions, but their more conservative social beliefs are used as a wedge to say, even if this liberal's talking about unions, you can't vote for them. They'll make gay marriage legal, or what have you. The duopoly is used as a crutch to garner support without working that hard, and to force concessions out of their constituents. Similarly, plenty of progressives aren't fans of the market-based solutions offered by corporate Democrats. But the Person X bad argument is always busted out to get the progressive vote without having to appeal to them too much on your platform. I hope it's not a hot take to say we should get rid of this binary thinking, if for no other reasons than to make politicians actually accountable to us. But this is far from the only issue that our left versus right binary creates. Let's look at some other ways this approach is harmful. Part 2. Can you spot the nuance? I sure can't. The main reason our right versus left rhetoric is harmful is because it fails to acknowledge any points between extremes, what you might call nuance. You're either this or that. You're with us or you're against us.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
This us versus them talk is good for campaigning, but it's horrible for actually making stuff happen. No matter your political leaning, this binary framework's inability to recognize nuance makes trying to change anything way harder than it needs to be. Let's look at an example. Since the American healthcare standard is privatized and employer-based, it's easy to lump everything that involves government meddling into a vague left. But that ignores the diversity of proposals. The Affordable Care Act seeks to reform private health insurance with features like pre-existing condition protection, which aims to keep insurance providers from denying coverage to people designated high risk. But it needs to be said that the ACA did not, nor did it want to, destroy the private health insurance market. Evidenced by the fact that one of its main features is a national online marketplace to browse and exchange plans largely from the private sector. And one could easily argue it acted as a giveaway to insurance providers by all of a sudden forcing a bunch of new customers to buy expensive insurance. This differs from public option proposals, which would leave the private market around but would diminish its role by likely absorbing a lot of clients. Which is way different than Medicare for All, which seeks to do away with the private health insurance market. Even if they all involve government in some form, these are fundamentally different models. They want different outcomes, and they disagree on the value of private insurance. But because we're trained to think of politics as left versus right, we lump them together in a unified camp and judge them based largely on our team affiliation. But the tricky thing about team rhetoric is the changing boundaries of what each team accepts. Did you know that the model for the ACA was the conservative counter to universal health care for years? It was cooked up in conservative think tanks. Newt Gingrich supported a similar plan when he was battling the Clintons on health care in the 90s. And most importantly, Mitt Romney passed a similar bill as governor of Massachusetts. It was considered the sensible alternative back then. But because Team Red decided to be against it when Obama was in office, it suddenly became Lenin's dreams come true. And the transitive properties of this claim are so bonkers when you tease it apart. Are you telling me that because Mitt Romney passed an ACA-like plan, he's suddenly a second-wave postmodern neo-Marxist? No, he's a center-right dweeb who passed a market-based, centrist healthcare bill. That's it. But that's only a realization you can make when your binary approach to politics is broken down, by acknowledging nuance. Another example of breaking down the left versus right rhetoric, I'll be honest, I, for about a year or so, assumed the ACA must have been decent because it was what my brain understood as the not right-wing solution. I was 17, get off my back, I didn't know any better. And it was only when I broke out of this team-cheering political mindset that I realized the ACA is a shitty solution and began to search for policies that I felt better suited our needs. I was only able to break out of that mindset when I stopped thinking about politics as a binary and considered the breadth of proposals out there, when I acknowledged the true spectrum. If we opened our hearts to the idea that not everything is an extreme, we could have good conversations about solutions based on their merits. But because we do away with nuance from the jump, even relatively modest policies are thrown out on account of being closer to the opposing party than we'd like. Hard to run a country going around talking like this. Jumping off those last points a bit, the left versus right talk leads folks to say some of the most boneheaded things. First, I present to you the worst piece of data from this campaign season, the claim that Kamala Harris is statistically more liberal than Bernie Sanders. How is that the case, you might ask? GovTrack bases its ideology scores on the number of bipartisan bills folks co-sponsor, which means Bernie, who has way more based policies than top cop Harris, scores as less liberal just because he co-sponsored or wrote a few more bipartisan bills. That is, to use an academic term, the shittiest way to talk about politics. That how often you only work with your team decides your ideology. Ideology should be measured by commitment to ideas, not party loyalty. Like when Bernie introduced multiple bills to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, a move consistent with his leftist approach to foreign policy and wars abroad. Does the bill suddenly make Bernie more conservative purely because it had a Republican co-sponsor? It could not possibly get more us versus them than this awful scoring system. And it's indicative of the wider problem of this faulty framework we're fed, causing Americans to say some of the darndest things. Speaking of Americans saying stupid shit, our binary thinking is limited to a single axis, which makes some topics really hard to process.
What lies at the far right end of the American political spectrum?
Anarchy would probably be on the very far right of the spectrum.
Here we have professional wrong person Ben Shapiro claiming anarchy, a dominantly socialist ideology, is right-wing because it's the least amount of government.
What? What the fuck?
This may be news to some of you, as it was to me earlier this year, but not every socialist loves government. Prominent writers and movements of socialism are distrustful of the state or flat out don't want one. So if we're trying to discuss a random anarcho-communist, someone who wants the abolition of government and for the economy to be organized as communist, how does the math within Ben's binary work out? Is that person radically left-wing because they want communism? Are they radically right-wing because they hate the government? Or through the synthesis of both, have they unlocked radical centrism? The answer is none of the above because trying to pin broad concepts on either side of a binary is unhelpful, as it only leads to answers that confuse or divide folks. This bad take is partially the fault of what we associate with either side of the binary, but it's mainly the fault of using a binary at all. If we approached politics with an eye to the diversity of thought out there, if we just understood that you could be a conservative or a capitalist while also thinking government is good, or could be a socialist while also thinking the government needs to be limited, we maybe wouldn't be drawn to such super wrong takes. But because our approach to politics is defined by these rigid binaries, we're left saying wacko shit like this. Lastly, our binary approach to politics is harmful because it keeps us from seeing areas of agreement. Obviously, there are huge disagreements at the core of our politics, but within the confines of the left and the right, there are occasionally places folks agree. Right-wing libertarians mostly agree with progressives that weed should be legal, that police shouldn't be militarized, and they sometimes think that unions are good. So when it comes to specific policies, there's room for coalitions between progressives and some sparse Republicans. Similarly, going back to the ACA, if we broke down the binaries around the topic, conservatives could see that plenty of Democrats who support the ACA, or a similar plan, actually love private health insurance. They, like you, believe commodifying health insurance and letting the free market do its thing is the way to go. They don't want the government to control everything, they just want some mild reforms to how private insurance operates while covering a few more folks in the lower income brackets. And I think we saw some binary destruction on the topic once the bill was passed. elements of the bill that the Republican base was told to hate before its passing, like pre-existing conditions protection, which Republicans said would destroy the market. But that part of the bill quickly became electoral poison for a Republican to come out against. Why is that? Because when this incredibly moderate reform became a part of their lives, and it wasn't just some abstract idea Republicans could propagandize about, a lot of conservative voters realized it's a good reform, and that it in some cases helped them directly. And those same voters could have realized the value of this policy and pressured their representatives for it a lot sooner if the binaries didn't get in the way. So here we see our binary approach to politics, mixed with the overbearing interests of the dueling parties, makes folks blind to areas of agreement. But as I've been yapping about complaints for long enough, let's talk about solutions. Part 3. Solutions. First off, it's important to expand past one binary and to talk about politics as a series of spectrums. There are a lot of different value sets that people hold, so it's important to diversify how we talk about and visualize it, which is why I think some visual spectrums the internet's cooked up are a good frame of reference. You've got the political compass test, which charts your score on two axes, libertarian versus authoritarian and left versus right. Then you've got the 8 values test, which charts your score on the spectrum of equality versus markets, nation versus world, liberty versus authority, and tradition versus progress. Then you've got the 9-axis test, which, oh bloody hell, that's a lot of spectrums. Well, suffice it to say, it gives you a lot of data to go off of. These spectrums are all pretty good at visualizing nuance in politics, but for simplicity's sake, I think the political compass is a solid start. To be clear, it's not perfect. I wish the graph had a section to define centrists. It falls into the trap of simple summaries for complex beliefs, and there are way more than 2 spectrums in politics. But even adding a second spectrum clarifies a lot. For example, with the political compass as your framework, it's hard to take Ben Shapiro's anarchy is right-wing bit seriously, because we're not talking about politics as just left versus right, but also left versus right and what you think of government. You could see that anarchy is actually the extreme position of the libertarian spectrum, and is not mutually exclusive to either the left or the right. And even that first step of nuance can help us have baseline conversations about how politics actually work. Which may sound like a low bar to cross, but we gotta start somewhere, you know? And I think if they made their way through the channels of politics, Americans could broadly gain a more nuanced understanding of the topic. With all that being said, let's wrap. Part 4. Conclusion. Listen guy, shit really do be fucked up though. American politicians and pundits have dug these ruts of political discourse they seem determined to stick to, and they're largely unhelpful at fostering any kind of productive conversation. So if I could leave my lovely, lovely viewers with final thoughts, it'd be to try to start deconstructing your internal political binaries. Try to think about politics not as a team sport, but as an alphabet soup of ideas to consider. Or I don't know, maybe that's a bad metaphor. Look, just stop being so fucking weird and rigid. I'm tired of seeing some of these head-ass takes. Just please get your shit together, America. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to toss me one of them likes and subscribe down below, clicking the little bell so you can know the exact nanosecond I release my next video. Special shout out to all my patrons over on Patreon, like the lovelies whose names are currently on screen. They help keep this train a-rolling, so if you really enjoy my videos, be sure to become a patron of mine. The link, of course, is down below. Thanks much, and I'll see y'all next time.